Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Stephen Gilchrist, and I'm lecturer of Indigenous Art at the University of Sydney. I'm also Deputy Director of the Power Institutes, and on behalf of the Power Institute and the Griffith University Art Museum, I'd really like to welcome you to the launch and celebration of the radical energy of this book, Gordon Bennett Selected Writings, edited by Angela Godard and Tim Riley-Walsh, and panel discussion, Artists After Gordon Bennett, Speaking Through Text, Corresponding with the Past. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people on whose land I'm now on, and which the Power Institute and the University of Sydney stands. This place was named by the Gadigal, for the Gadigal, and because of the Gadigal, and I pay my deep respect to their ancestors of the past, present, and future, who have been keepers and couriers of this knowledge. I share a deep commitment to making visible, audible, and tangible the Indigenous knowledge embedded in and safeguarded through place. It's my great pleasure to be moderating this event on Gordon Bennett, an artist who has been an inspiration and has challenged me over a long period of time. I'm also thrilled to be sharing this platform with some of my favorite people and some of my favorite artists. Vernon, Julie, Gough, Warraba, Weatherall will be in conversation with me, each other, and the editors of Gordon Bennett Selected Writings, Angela Godard and Tim Riley-Walsh. And together we'll be considering Bennett's impact on us as individuals, but also his indelible impact on the field of art. And so I thought it might be nice if everyone introduced ourselves as we begin. So perhaps Julie?
Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, Julie Gough. I'm a Trawalway woman. My family are originally from Tebakuna, far northeastern Tasmania, or Lutruwita, more better said. And I live on Mawinina country, that's the Hobart area. I'm a half-time curator at TMAG Museum in Hobart and also an artist.
My name's Vernon. I live in Brisbane now, and I'm originally from North Queensland. I think of myself as a Bama rainforest people. I just want to acknowledge the people and the language and the languages and the communities of Brisbane and Greater Brisbane.
My name is Warraba Weatherall. I'm a Kamilaroi man based in Brisbane, same as Vernon, so I'm on Turrbal and Yagara land. Practicing artist, but also a lecturer at Griffith University for the Contemporary Australian Indigenous Arts course.
Hi everyone, I'm Tim. I'm one of the editors of the book alongside Angela Godard. I live on Wurundjeri country, the Kulin Nation in Naarm. And I'm currently curator in residence at Gertrude here in Naarm, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you today.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm Angela Godard, and I'm the director of Griffith University Art Museum. I live here on Jagera and Turrbal country here in Brisbane, and that's where I'm joining you from. And I'm of settler English, Scottish, and Irish descent.
Thank you, all the panelists. So firstly, we're going to be hearing from Angela and Tim, then Vernon, Julie, and Warraba will be speaking individually, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion. So Gordon Bennett's 3 decades of practice represent an ongoing conversation with historical texts and images, and Selected Writings reveals he corresponded just as closely with the work of his peers. In a 1992 letter to Eugene Carchesio, a fellow artist, occasional collaborator, and frequent correspondent, Bennett wrote, "I too am a disciple of silence, though that may be hard for some people to believe. My strategy has been to point out what the centre is not, what identity is not, especially for Aboriginal people, because, as any metaphysician will tell you, a healthy identity is first necessary before any identity can be transcended." So despite Bennett's considered dedication to silence on matters of identity, which led to the non-performance where he declined to speak about his works and public events, Bennett always used the combination of text and images to speak powerfully, even loudly, about identity through his work. And Vernon, Julie and Warraba continue his cultural legacy by questioning the restrictions of categorization with the visual disruption of text. So I'm really looking forward to hearing their reflections on Bennett's influence on their work and consider the significant role that writing, text and voice play in their own practices. And I'd like to invite Angela and Tim to speak a little bit about the motivations of the book, what sets it apart, the process of editing and compiling all of these writings, and perhaps contextualize our discussion around the significance of text and correspondence for this panel.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And gosh, where to begin? I'll speak a little bit about the existing scholarship on Bennett, perhaps in the context for bringing the publication into existence. Gordon, of course, was an esteemed alumnus of the Queensland College of Art, and when I began in this position at the Art Museum, I was very keen to honour that relationship, and knowing that lots of great work had been done actually within this process here by my predecessor, Simon Wright, who was the director here before I came on. And we were always thinking about what might be the next interesting project to do in relation to Gordon's work. And of course, a large body of writing has accumulated over the last 3 decades by many of Australians' leading art historians that have engaged with the issues and the debates and the positions that his work has taken. And key contributions have been found in the work of Rex Butler, Kelly Gelatley, Bob Lingard, Terry Smith, and Simon Wright, of course, and perhaps most significantly also in the seminal texts and essays of Ian Mclean, who had a very close and fruitful relationship with Gordon. And these texts have become the major vehicle to understanding Bennett's work. But maybe Tim could talk a bit more about how we thought we might foreground Gordon's voice itself.
Thanks, Angela. Yeah, so really the publication is one that intended to add to this existing body of knowledge that Angela has introduced, but really importantly by foregrounding Bennett's own words and perspectives. And we felt that it was time for Bennett's own voice to really be heard much more strongly, because this is really important for him, because I think unlike the work, which was often quite, brash and could sometimes be kind of quite overt, Bennett as a person was also a quieter presence. His voice as well was often diminished by the media, by misrepresentation, I guess, of his often quite nuanced views around identity. And so this opportunity to kind of really put his voice at the fore was a really kind of critical one. So through this approach, the book really reveals Bennett's art and life in a new and hopefully insightful detail for readers, and describing his methods and thoughts so sensitively attuned to this, the colonial history of so-called Australia, and this determination of his to kind of expand what he saw as the restrictive bounds of identification. Obviously, in putting together a book like this, there are several major pieces of writing that we've included in the book that already published and were already kind of distributed quite widely for most of the audience. I feel like they probably would be aware of the manifesto, which was also recently republished by the IMA. And there is a link to that publication as well, which hopefully we might be able to drop in the chat at some point. But there are also a lot of major texts that are quite hard to find that are in out-of-print publications. And so the opportunity to kind of champion perhaps those kind of lesser known texts was sort of an important thing. The thought of kind of getting Bennett's voice further out there and making it easier for kind of, young scholars or young artists to kind of reach this content is just so important. So, I mean, an example of that is a text in the book Aesthetics and Iconography, an artist approach, which featured in the catalogue for Arat Jara, Art of the First Australians, which was the first major Indigenous-led exhibition to tour internationally. And of course, for anyone who wants to know more about Aratjara, you can't do much better than listen to Stephen's fantastic lecture for ACCA last year. And I think there might be a link to that as well for those who are interested. So these are kind of one of the kind of major kind of pushes and desires for us in putting together the book. But some of the kind of interesting kind of quirks or qualities of the writing and the work that reveal themselves. One of them is this kind of folding back on itself and interconnectedness rather of Bennett's work. And I might pass back to Angela if she wanted to kind of add to that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tim. And we talk about this as a almost like an iterative quality within, especially the early writings from the 1990s, such as Aesthetics and Iconography and the Manifesto, where we see Bennett actually creating a narrative around his work by returning to and repeating arguments that have been introduced in earlier texts. And I think that you see that this quality, especially seeing the recent Goma exhibition late last year and earlier this year, you see that echoed within the painting practice as well, where he kind of builds this lexicon of motifs that get continually kind of come back through and get repurposed in new works and deepen their already existing meanings. Kelly Gelatley actually called this as the interconnectedness of Bennett's work, or its ability to fold back upon itself while forging new ground. And then, of course, there's the use of text more explicitly as a medium within his works. Here we think of the word lists, which Bennett discusses in really insightful detail in his letter to Ian Mclean in the publication, where he describes their embeddedness in Basquiat's use of very similar registers of language and text in the form of works themselves. I think that there are very few Australian artists who we can kind of investigate so closely through their own writing, and as well as this use of writing and text within their works. And I think that that's one of the qualities that we thought was worth celebrating within this particular publication. So Tim, but there's also the quality of not writing and not speaking, which you might like to talk about.
Sure, thanks, Angela. This was kind of, I think, personally for me, one of the kind of more rewarding, one of the many rewarding aspects of this book was this kind of recognition that for Bennett, it was not always necessary to speak and write. He did this constant sort of demand kind of to represent your positions and articulate them. Certainly in his early parts of his career, he did that very willfully and was happy to participate. But over time, that became kind of a more complicated process for him. So he was really, as well as much as there was some hesitancy around it, he also had this an element of feeling of uncertainty towards language and to writing's capacity to convey a fuller sense of experience. Painting, on the other hand, always remained as this very consistent and trusted language for Bennett. And certainly this book still remains a testament to writing's importance to Bennett, but making sure to kind of represent this element of uncertainty was important. So it's about also representing Bennett's own selectiveness towards writing as a process. It is not a consistently rewarding medium for him. And often, as this book evidences, hopefully, how he valued silence and withdrawal as methods. So part of this distrust, I think, and through this process of putting together the book, is really based in how often Bennett's views on his cultural identity or his very careful and nuanced investigations into history were sort of misrepresented, especially by the media, as I said earlier. And as Stephen mentioned, non-performance is such a kind of a crucial aspect of this book. And I think this is where we started to really kind of grapple with the significance of, well, what does it mean not to speak or not to write? It's not simply an absence, it's saying something in its own particular way. So in 92, while Bennett's in France as part of the Moulin Chandon Fellowship, he conceives of this sort of durational conceptual work that we've described in the book. So from 92 onwards, he says, I'm no longer going to participate in public speaking within Australia. And he found that so beneficial that he was like, I'm going to extend it again. In 94, he says, I'm not speaking publicly internationally. And that continued. Non-performance, as he called it, continued until his untimely passing, of course, in 2014. And this is really kind of one of the more sort of vital examples of this kind of what he saw as kind of the benefit of silence and withdrawal. Within that as well, you know, there are key figures that became kind of interlocutors and, you know, correspondents. And you know, Ian Mclean, of course, this is a very important one. And Ian began writing on Gordon's work in 93. But Bennett stops really publishing his own writing officially in 99. And from this point on, he very rarely conducted any interviews. There were some exceptions to that. So there was a commitment to this, but also, you know, writing remained in the works very strongly. And so he remained, you know, deeply committed to that as well. But maybe to kind of dig a little bit more into the importance of kind of correspondence, I might pass back to Angela.
Well, I mean, at first it might seem like a real problem to, in terms of putting together a book of writings, is that there's a gap. There's silence and withdrawal within those writings. But we also found it really important to examine why it happened and its meaning, because it's framed by Bennett as a conceptual or performative project in itself. But then we're also keen to see what remained and what form of the writing still kind of continues. And that's clearly the use of text within the work, but also in the forms of correspondence and also to some extent interviews with different interlocutors. So Bennett values dialogue, but it's dialogue in a very particular sense. It's with his audience. And of course, he's always very insistent upon the role of the viewer in terms of completing an artwork, and that remains throughout. But then there is also, I think, you know, playing out within the book, this amazing written correspondence. Part of that's driven, you know, it's pre-internet. A lot of those written letters and writings. But there's also these very close relationships with artists. And Eugene Carchesio, as you mentioned, Stephen, is a really important person there. But then there's also collaborations and engagements as well with figures like Tim Johnson and Amance Tillers. And then with Ian Mclean, there remains this fairly consistent exchange. Even when Bennett stops providing these statements alongside exhibitions, he continues to provide Ian with, you know, explainers for new works that Ian might be writing on. But also Bennett writes quite late in the piece as well, really important piece to Ihor Holubitsky on the figure of John Citizen, which is a really important kind of element. So to finish with a bit more process in terms of putting together everything, Tim, it was a bit of a ride, wasn't it?
It was a fantastic ride. And I think those were the kind of the gems that we kind of came across through this process, were those kind of unexpected texts and about bodies of work that maybe aren't often kind of framed enough in Bennett's voice. And certainly, as Angela mentioned, the letter to Ihor is fantastic. John Citizen, an aspect of Bennett's practice which sort of still needs to be kind of examined in, I think, greater detail. So including those aspects are really great. Certainly, I mean, as editors, Angela and I have really been blessed with a group of fantastic collaborators on the project. And they made the process of putting together this book such a pleasure and an incredibly rewarding experience. And we couldn't, you know, do this without the, you know, participation and the absolute support of Leanne Bennett as the representative of the estate of Gordon Bennett. And Leanne played a very crucial and very key role in the process of putting together the publication. I mean, the nature of something like this is there is so much rich content to include. It is selected writings, it's not a completed writings. And so that process of working through the content was kind of incredibly enriching. And, you know, chatting to Leanne this afternoon, she really wanted me to kind of communicate as well how supportive and collaborative she found this process of working with Power and Griffith and Angela and myself, which is a very kind thing to share. certainly I've been very blessed as well by Leanne's support. This project emerged from process of really kind of deep research as part of my MPhil thesis into Bennett's archive, which began itself because of an experience working alongside Leanne to document Gordon's studio after his passing. So the project did really emerge from that. And so that really informed, I guess, some of the foundations for the book, but then through this process with Angela, we discovered so much more and were able to kind of frame that, I think, in a good way. And you can't do something like this either without a fantastic designer. And Michael Phillips is an amazing designer and knew Gordon, and also is a long-term committed fan of Gordon's work. And so having that someone with such passion and energy is important. And Michael and Leanne connected in such a brilliant way. And we also would need to thank Carl Warner for his total professionalism and amazing kind of photography and documentation as well. And I couldn't forget as well, Mark Ledbury and Marnie Williams at Power Publications, who have been second to none in this process. But as way of a conclusion and to link to Julie, I thought it would be important to also acknowledge that, throughout the years of working on the book, mentioning it to artists, Angela and I in discussion with various artists, telling them what we were working on, this really meant that each time we discussed it, that we would find a different or a new artist who found this vital influence from Bennett, from his work, from his writings, or his thinking. So in a powerful sense, though Bennett's writing and correspondence grew more directed over his years, became more about sort of communication with sort of a private, sort of small handful of people. Through his art, it grew further and further outward, and it only continues to. And we really hope that this book will play a small role in continuing this process. Thank you. And I'd just like to hand over to Julie now, who will be providing her thoughts on Bennett's legacy.
Thank you. Is that on screen? Yeah, I can embark. I think I was provided some questions which helped me kind of get onto the page. So I might kind of speak through those and see how I go in kind of 8-minute situation. So I was firstly asked about where I first encountered Bennett's work and the effect they had on me. And I'm just throwing some slides up of my work in response to this connection and really influence of Bennett on my work and life. So I commenced art school at Curtin Uni in West Australia in 1991 after a year of night school drawing classes at TAFE in Perth, and then carried from that, completed a BA at the sculpture department at Curtin. In 94, I commenced honours at Uni of Tas in the art school in Hobart. In 97, 98, I went to Goldsmiths for a 1-year MFA degree study, thanks to a Samstag scholarship at Uni of South Australia. In 97, I was invited to exhibit in an exhibition with Gordon and Brooke Andrew at Boomali called Extracts. And these are like these really redundantly ancient slides I have, sorry about this. But it was a very pivotal experience for me, in that I had in earlier work since 91 been keenly aware of Gordon's work and his means of deftly working across mediums in a collage sense. I was attached to, and since with the sculptural departments and ways of working across dimensions, but to me, I never really viewed Gordon's work as flat, as singular plane. I think particularly it's that idea of intercepting works in books or now on the internet, that the chance to actually exhibit with Gordon was extreme, particularly because he'd moved into the video realm. And if anyone can let me know the work he presented was himself and the whipping work, yeah. And the work here that I was showing at the time was about very much, I was kind of a generation behind in thinking. I was working through identity and family and the era of the 1960s and what was kind of this sense of what if in our family history, what if, and what does it mean to openly assert identity in a culture in which you don't feel at any time safe or secure to do so. So I returned to Hobart and studied and submitted my PhD thesis in mid-2001, and being invited to speak on this panel, it became, it was brought to my attention how much I referenced Gordon in my PhD thesis, which I've now kind of pulled off the shelf and spent time with in the last few days. And yeah, it's a fantastic reminder, because what I wrote back then in 2001 is still very much the case. So this period through the 90s, Gordon, alongside Fiona Foley and Tracy Moffat, were very great influences, continue to be so on my work. They showed that there's place and potential for collapsing time then and now, and that the past isn't really past through art. So that became, and since is my main means of dialogue with the world. So yeah, one of the main works I referred to in my thesis was self-portrait, but I always wanted to be one of the good guys in 1990, for example. So I think I was immersed in very much a similar kind of journey of, because that work situates and perpetually reminds me of my dawning, my own sense of unfolding and continuing horror at what is the basis of the nationhood of this unreal but lived fiction called Australia, and at the extent of our ongoing subjugation and the attempted annihilation of First Peoples here. So to that unfolding dawning of not being one of the good guys, and the irony, and thank God for that. So again, this is a later work, The Murder of Crows. It's referencing Bennett's work as well as Foley's work, Annihilation of the Blacks, somewhere in between. So Bennett's word work always sits with me, the double entendre of everything, the potential of between the lines and the distrust of the given texts, the given order of things. And by word use in this way, often only by and in the titles of works that I create, I hope an audience might see through my eyes that things are never only what they seem at first glance, and the apple is poisoned, the word is not God or gospel, etc. This work, their deftness across the mediums, techniques, references, and cite endless. So also refreshingly mirrored the plight or mode of attending to an ongoing crisis. So this, for me, this kind of epigenetic pull to attend to something serious and multi-dimensionally by any means. I'm affected very much by work that attempts that, and the potential for the audience to be on that journey and to be actively participating, which I find easier in three-dimensional video installation type work. So then I was asked a little bit about my PhD. I wrote about that his writing is always refreshingly real and resonant. His words were available and published to me at a critical time in my own emerging art practice. His seemingly singular position was important when I returned to Tasmania, my maternal home country, but a place I'd never lived, to build a new life in an old place of family. And I suppose that my journey is an ongoing kind of personal and social experiment of what is return and all the attendances of identity with that, what they do or might mean. So there's continual, I think, in a sense, conversation with Gordon and his work, even that is not here, he's still carried with me in a way. His commitment to his work and expressing himself gave me the same sense of purpose, courage, plus a kind of procedural guide to how to continue assessing and analysing. And then I became a detective, a forensic form of artist. And as a loner, I still feel a connection to his work and journey of reflecting and responding simultaneously without presuming to seek or speak for others beyond oneself, a kind of insider-outsider path. Let me know when I should conclude, because I just have endless notes. check a little longer or stop
No,
there?
please keep
Going
going,
a little
Julie.
bit longer? Oh, yeah, okay. Then there was a question of using historic text and my engagement with that. And this is, sorry, that's another one of those of the work, Murder of Crows, because our people here, our old people, were referred to as crows by the colonists, and they would relate to each other how many crows they'd killed that day. So it's kind of word play across crows, and but with annihilation as a kind of eye chart. Anyway, so I'm very fortunate that work and pathways forged by the artist I've mentioned helped create a foundation for mine and others' works to be more easily received and expected, even for doorways, I think, to be more easily opened and opportunities arise, including access to collections and institutions such as the archives that a decade earlier wouldn't have been so available to me. The language of colonised Tasmania is telling and full of clues to what occurred here. For example, colonial property names, and very useful ways to delineate to the present what happened where. So there's point of difference for me is that I'm very much on country and very specific stories that are personal that I relate. And earlier on in my practice, through the early 90s, I was looking at Australia as an entity in itself and what was happening and had happened to Aboriginal people across this kind of continent of many countries. And but from the late 90s, I became very particular and more involved in Tasmania. So there's a difference there in approach or the kind of palette of influence and what I expect in context to work with. So the period of art making from the 90s, late 90s, also coincided for Gordon and my work with this amplification and expectation of postmodernist modes of mashing things up, collaging, questioning, reassembling, and also that mixed blessing of appropriating. That's very interesting. With language in my work, again, I think there's, every time I look at an artwork of mine in the last 72 hours, all I see is Gordon Bennett's work. So I'm a bit kind of like, but yeah, there's a lot of modifying existing works, text upon them, or taking texts to country. So I suppose the realm we're in with digital and affordable equipment just changed practice and would have done so for his own work, I expect. And also, yeah, so place is really critical, but how to reapply text across dimensions and other mediums to affect an engagement with an audience that might not otherwise happen, and for them to understand something of history that otherwise tends, I think, to remain hidden. Yeah, should I continue or stop? I can talk later if anyone has time. Or, no.
Yeah,
thanks very much.
We've definitely got time, Julie, but why don't we invite Vernon to maybe start thinking about, when did you first encounter Gordon Bennett's work? Thanks very much, Julie. That was amazing, and we'll pick up on those conversations.
Hello all. I suppose Gordon Bennett, he's kind of, even though my whole career has been in Brisbane here, he's kind of been set aside from what happens in Brisbane. And we those of us who live here, we're all aware of it. And I show with the same gallery. But of course we all did meet Gordon, and which was, you know, gratifying and satisfying and enriching too. But I first joined Ballast Gallery in 2000 or late 1999, and Gordon was showing with Ballast Gallery, and of course he was showing also with Sutton as well. And but it was very exciting seeing. I used to go into the stockroom and just flick through his paintings when they came in, and when he started producing the post World Trade Center attack paintings, I used to go in and have a look at those when they would come in, and it was just fascinating I mean, for me, he represents a sense of permission. He and Trevor Nichols, actually, and but in another way too, Gordon also, he kind of exercised his sense of self, however confused or settled or unstable or up in the air, he was always kind of, you had a sense that he was kind of working through it in his work all the time. And but his sense of permission was evident in his work, and it was inspiring for someone like me, and but particularly the idea that when he was going to have an exhibition, you knew you were going to turn up for it. There would be a richness there. There would be something to be said, but you had no idea what he was going to do. And I kind of took that approach to making art and just run with it. And good or bad, it was evident too that he didn't give a care about what people thought of his work or himself. And so I just thought, well, you know, it just means you can be whatever you want to be. And he was, but it was evident also he was kind of working through lots and lots of identity, as you say, Julie, working through lots and lots of identity kind of issues and that too, and those are all, that was very much where we kind of differed, because my identity was never kind of in a question. But I appreciate the idea that you would kind of undertake this kind of journey towards kind of not just finding yourself, but investigating what it is. And that was interesting to me, because he's really the first and still the only kind of figure that kind of really worked on it and working on expanding the idea of identity, particularly his own, and not dismissing anything. And that's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of attractive in a slightly voyeuristic way, but also it's attractive in that you kind of feel like you can settle on something and then still be what you were before, and then move on to the next thing. And that was very, very much evident in who he was, of course. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Vernon. And we'll have a conversation about all of these points in a moment. But yeah, I'd like to invite Warraba to talk about, maybe where did you first encounter Gordon's work, and maybe what effect did it have on?
So I think the first place I saw Gordon's work was at the old Milani Gallery at Wollongabba. And seeing a range of works there when I was first doing my undergrad, and was just really blown away of, I guess the inspiring thing about his work is that his ability, but also his accuracy to communicate such, brutal truths a lot of the time. And a lot of the time it was such a vulnerable thing to the way that he presented it. A lot of the time, for myself anyway, there's so much honesty that's in a work, and then some of those complexities in a cultural sense as well of understanding identity, unpacking transgenerational trauma, looking at cultural standards or constructs that we've become to learn and impose on ourselves. That it's very confronting as well, and to have that conversation openly with majority non-Indigenous audience, and having them critique and comment on those complexities without that lived experience is pretty daunting. So that's just the sort of the complexities that I first sort of recognized, but I was just taken by how brave a lot of his work is, and how blunt it is as well. Like, he would just punch you in the guts, and it hits you. But those his work not only just sort of correcting those historical narratives, but there's also an element of it where it's so specific and so guttural that it's like it's the psychology of colonization. And I feel like it is very psychological because it's so in-depth and specific to unpacking his experience, and his experience is a shared experience between so many of us as well. I guess that highlighting those things through artistic discourse decentralizes those things as the dominant narrative, and so many of those standards or those norms deriving from historical pseudoscience, and all of these when he speaks about aesthetics and its historical place with precedents of taste, and all these theorists and philosophers commenting on what that actually is, which is so far removed from a grounded theory of Indigenous arts discourse, and applying to our own experiences. But then so many of those things are so ingrained and it accumulates as this Western precedence of knowledge where do Indigenous peoples get the opportunity to engage, but also to see our practice and our conversations as rigorous, as informed, and having that self-determined agency throughout that. So throughout his practice, I see that, and the ability that I don't know exactly what was so successful beyond just being a great artist, but his ability to actually get through to so many people of different backgrounds. It wasn't just black fellas, wasn't just white fellas, it was an array of people nationally, internationally, that respected and understood and engaged with those works. And so I think that's something that I constantly think about, and considering what part of his work or what type of his personality were those things, because they were so confronting. But one of the things, when I was reading the book that Angela very kindly gave to me, one of the passages of it was on page 21, one of the quotes from Bennett himself, it reads, "I'm interested in the ethnocentric boundaries implicit in language as a categorizing system. These boundaries are as visible as the perspective lines that create illusionistic depth in Western painting, the illusion of a harmonious whole." And I think just his ability to capture not only visual language, but written language, oral language, whatever it might be, that it's got real substance, it's got real power, that, immediately when I read that, and I keep reading it 10 or so times to unpack it, is I guess the direct aim at Western science by those terms in there with, ethnography, ethnocentric, and looking at language, looking at categorization, thinking about things within what would you say, like a cultural taxonomy, and looking at how we have been taxonomized, how we've been categorized, and so many of the issues that comes with creating a hierarchical knowledge system, or at least who has the voice, the valid voice to contribute those things. So I think in that way, there's a tension in his work with not only the language and referencing those things, but the semiotics and the symbols that he uses is so on point that it's directly referencing like the diagrams, the grid work that's in his work, that, you know, a lot of people draw those references to Mondrian and things like that. And yes, it's got those relationships, but the way that he presents some of his other works with some of his self-portraits, where it's got the grid and the, what was it? It was like Gollum, or I can't remember the title. But one of his self-portrait works where it's got the grid overlaying the human silhouette, the human form, which then anchors to scientific disciplines again, in that it's the what is it, the canon of proportions, and looking at standardizing human anatomy and all of these things that are directly related to Indigenous experiences in being exploited and creating these false senses of identity, constructed, racialized, etc. So the ability to go to the depths to research so many of those things and have an understanding of not only how they've impacted those theoretical kind of views and how that's sort of normalized and disciplined within contemporary society, and makes me wonder about his process and that research, that it's almost like a sort of poking the bear of like, you have to know I guess from my own understanding anyways, of understanding your own experience and your own traumas of something that is continually present, is something that is pretty unimaginable, that not only, you know, it's not expecting people to sort of respond in hindsight, but it's something that's so present that to have the mental clarity to unpack, understand, but then also take on the responsibility of educating others is pretty remarkable. So yeah, with you know, like the canon of proportions, looking at you know, those types of things, central vanishing point that's always continued through his work is the real key anchoring point to symbolism and stuff that attaches it to those things, and brings it to a contemporary conversation. And you know, the canon, I think it's Greek for measuring rod or a standard, and then so considering those things, it's like it's not very much different from a scale rod in archaeology, a scale card, surveyor's rod within surveying. All of these things are intimately married to our experiences of dispossession of land being scientifically categorized. All of these things. So even though he may have had a specific intention through his work, I think that there's so many similar experiences we can read into and unpack it and understand it in various ways that lead us to like the same endpoint that we're talking about: decentralizing power, complex languages and histories, but how can we look at things that are considered periphery, and reestablish the agency and the voice of the people that know it best.
Great, thank you, Warraba. I wanted to ask a question for the three panelists about the use of text in all of your work. Maybe I can start with Vernon. I'm thinking about the ways in which you use text, manipulate text, play with the kerning, the spaces between text. And just thinking about, what is your process in terms of finding the right kinds of text?
I think that core use of text in the belief that words have power, I think. But I also think that, and I'm sure Gordon believed this too, that given how highly designed all of his work was, I think individual letters are highly designed, and that's attractive. And when you have a font of highly designed letters into words that have weight to them, you develop a kind of inherent economy of use, and certainly that's what I read in Gordon's work, and of kind of applying that directly to my own use of words. I'm very aware that you don't waste words and you don't use throwaway lines, because it just lessens the work altogether. And I'm sure everything Gordon Bennett did was done with that approach. I think all of his writing certainly has that characteristic inherent in it. There is never a wasted word and no throwaway lines. And certainly that's an approach that served me well, but I think it served us all, I think. And you kind of, that kind of approach is going to go on and on. I think that will always be something that provides an anchor to anybody's work if they're using text, I think. But certainly for me, it starts with the design of the words themselves, and the selection of words that have weight, and how do we want to use them, but there is also a curiosity around double meanings and words that were invented for a certain kind of purpose, and are there different ways to use that, and you find out how much weight a word can have and how many uses a word can have, and kind of how best to use a line even, and this is before you even start playing with scale, and I very much get all of that from Gordon Bennett. So and the idea that you can be fearless if you present something that's highly designed. So yeah.
No, and Warraba and Julie, I know text is also very important in your work, and it also has a heaviness to it, but it's often from colonial texts, maybe and Warraba's your work with museum collections as well. Could you talk a little bit about your engagement with text? What draws you to a particular historical archive or space even?
With me? Or... I was just thinking when Vernon was speaking about the what's going on is for me that that Gordon threw down a kind of challenge to be like create something aesthetically compelling, but have a kind of purposeful essence, which I'm drawn to try to make something like information approachable and absorbed. So perhaps I don't necessarily want to be an artist, but that's what's happening, because I want to show, demonstrate what has happened here in the past that came to produce, my family today, that through following kind of his guidelines in a way to just continue, like keep agile, one step ahead, this mode and approach to get to the bottom of everything, the basis, the core, and shuffle things up. So there's something that has, served me well in kind of what appears to be probably some overlap in approach with, I forget what your question was about text, but yeah, I just trying to present, I'm just always learning, because I've been called overly didactic, and yeah, the compulsion to I've pasted books over, entire floors, etc. So yeah, it's my perpetual challenge to pare back and attempt to see what is the minimal amount of a text. But language in sound is coming into video work, and a complete sound piece where I sang not that long ago. Probably also their influence from Christian Thompson, for example. So yeah, I think there's this camaraderie community of contemporary artists that I find really important. And those earlier days, there were very few, and now there's very many of us that I've gone into another complete kind of response, but yeah, I'll just leave that for a moment and let you continue. Yeah.
No, thank you, Julie. I mean, I think, yeah, it is exciting, all the kind of cross-fertilization that is happening. And maybe, Warraba, you want to talk about, or you'd like to talk about maybe how documents lend formal parameters to your work in terms of museum catalogues, index cards, thinking about to know and possess. Could you speak a little bit about your engagement with text?
Yeah, funnily enough, to go back to Vernon as well, when I was interviewing him as an undergrad for one of my assignments, I remember I was asking what does he do as an artist in his disciplines, and what his mediums he's working in, and he responded with whatever suits the concept, and that's when I started to really look at art and different methods within your practice to do that. And one of those works that I was highlighting at the time of his was the If I Was White. Was that one? Sorry, brother, forgot the name. But to draw it back to my practice and Gordon's work as well. As I mentioned before, like the symbolism, the diagrams, and those type of tools that are used within scientific text, I feel like there's real power in having accuracy, because it's the same methodical process that the science has gone through. And so I feel like whether valid or not, in the process, it's very important to follow a considered methodology in that process. Whether it's text in the composition, index cards that are very direct and blunt, then not any sort of nice language. It's just very, here's the sequence number, who's acquired it, what collection, what's all this sort of locale information. And so I followed that process with a body of work, To Know and Possess, which was looking at museum index cards of real Kamilaroi cultural materials around the world, which would be an ongoing body of work. And I didn't make any amendments to those, just so, like, as the directness of not interchanging anything, that people who don't have access to museum collections, or don't know that there's ancestral human remains still within museum collections, that people are aware of that. And quite bluntly, it says that in very direct graphic language. And so, following the scale of the museum index cards as 6x4, and being very intentional to replicate those the scale and dimensions of those things as well. And funnily enough, that came from a large body of research, and something that I often think about Gordon's work whenever I read this passage from Alan Sekula, an American photographer. But he talks about the most important thing within the archive is not cultural materials, but the filing cabinet, because it's what holds all of those materials. He also talks about the importance of lineage of practices and methods, particularly in photography, but I think it applies to many others. In you know, a landscape painting derives from a targeted terrain. Portraiture derives from physiognomy and police mugshots. Or similarly, anatomical depictions of the human body, or clinical depictions. So I feel like those things come through within Gordon's work as well, and intentionally using, you know, shocking and reactive sort of text. It makes me think of Daddy's Little Girl, and how blunt and you know, shocking it is, but how real it is that racism is taught within the home, and it's something that is so normalized to have, you know, the father in the armchair approving his daughter making racial slurs with alphabetical blocks and things like that. So I think it's text is a very important thing in not just being direct, because I think text can also be just as ambiguous as any other symbols, and we can receive that and understand that in so many different ways, and I think it's just one way that we can communicate, rather than being better or worse. It just serves a purpose, like I guess like Vernon was telling me when I was in undergrad.
Thanks, Warraba. I was really wanting to also pick up on something, Vernon, that you said about permission, you know, how you give yourself permission, and maybe Julie and Warraba could also think about this, but also perhaps think about the power of transgression as well. You know, how do you think about, you know, creating works that could be or are deliberately transgressive? And yeah, this is for all three of you.
Well, for myself, I mean, it's that old thing about not being overly concerned about what anyone wants to think of me. And you know, when I kind of came onto the scene, so to speak, in the 2000s, early 2000s, there was still not a lot of us, and we not only did we not have many friends, as you well know, Julie, not only did we not have many friends, but we had more than enough enemies to go around. So the idea that you could come onto the scene and be universally loved, it was not a thing for Black artists of our ilk or genre. And so the idea that we came onto the scene and kind of stuck around was not only radical, but kind of a bit crazy, and I think a lot of people still find it a bit nonsensical. Actually, there are a lot that think it nonsensical still, and so for someone, so to have, you know, like some of the artists, stronger artists that came out of Bamali, like Fiona Foley, in particular, to have artists like that and Gordon kind of blaze away, and shining very brightly, I have to say, was kind of not so much providing a safe space, but kind of laying down a trail, you know. But yeah, certainly not safe. I mean, it's still not now, but you know, there is a space there that you know, has been made for us, and you know, any number of transgressions, seriously, and still happening now. But it comes from that sense of fearlessness, and it's not cavalier either. just a very sure sense of purpose, and a very sure sense of pathway, knowing that you set yourself on a path and you have to follow it through. And you know, that's all there is to it. And I think it comes from that. And of course, you know, if people describe it as radical or you know, transgression, then so be it, I think. But that's my position. It's always been like that.
I think it's another kind of, yeah, he threw another gauntlet, another way of, yeah, there's this legacy of just when you think you know what he was going to do, he did something else and wilder. It was pretty impressive, and kind of got it, yeah, you kind of, I feel a sense of, yeah, am I pushing myself? And it partly comes from Gordon, people such as Gordon, to, yeah, it's a really important legacy to say, well, why not go over there for a while? You know, let's go down this byway and see if I can say something better, differently. So yeah, and what you're saying about that whole, I wonder about, like, I think many of us have gravitated towards each other because we have similar concerns, but we also, there's that whole art world, art market, this whole strange thing that artists support that surrounds us, that kind of we behave in particular ways in this kind of bubble that probably need Richard Bell to bring us into line with, considering as well that times have changed since, you know, over recent years in particular, like when looking at how much we might or might not be manipulated and the angst in that, or how we live within the system that we do as in this art world. Sorry, I'm getting more vague, but yeah, because I looked up the work that I always wanted to be one of the good guys, thinking, oh, where is that? Which collection? You know, since I last wrote about it in 2000, and it sold for some unbelievable sum in New York 2 years ago. Yeah. And then I saw it was actually in an Aboriginal art auction, which kind of concerned me, because I thought, well, Gordon wouldn't have really wanted to be delineated in that manner. And if he was here today, what would he make of this? And I reckon a giant explosion with a giant whip and a black box, kind of, or what, yeah, anyway, the world continues and we are growing in numbers, and we just have to kind of, I feel, keep pushing these envelopes and questioning what system we're supporting that kind of feeds us. It's really tricky. Yeah, because I like critiquing and thinking about the past and what happened in the 1820s and truth telling and all this. But meanwhile, I'm in this realm that I don't quite understand, that we're all part of when we get to talk about art writing and art critics and art history. I kind of run for the hills and look at colonial texts and not at what I'm kind of not facing the art realm in a way.
Yeah. I'll go, Angela.
Oh, I was just going to say, unfortunately, Stephen's dropped out, but go on, Warraba.
Yeah, no, I think the question, it makes me think about what context. Like, there's so many things that could be seen as transgressions. You know, there's cultural protocols. There's you know, other things in the arts that you know might not be as palatable to a certain audience and things like that. But I think that the great thing about Gordon's work is that it is so provocative, and it is saying the things that aren't said a lot of the times, or in a particular way. That's the great thing about contemporary art and about his practice, is that they're the people that we need, and that, you know, arts leads, you know, a lot of the time social political discourse and pushes the boundaries and makes the changes, all of the sort of artistic disciplines. And so I think people that are doing that, and particularly Gordon, that is critical to understanding our own identities and what we perceive to be the standard or what's acceptable, and who says that. Like that, to me, it's kind of just a kind of, you know, a shitty reason just to conform to someone else's ideals. Like, you know, there's so many different, you know, sort of levels and layers to it that I think that anything is up for grabs into pushing the boundaries and articulating the context and what can be perceived as a transgression or acceptable or not. Yeah.
Sorry about that. I was putting a lot of value in silence or something, but I wanted to, yeah, you know, Bennett also, you know, saw this great value in silence, and I was just wondering for all of you, you know, there is this pressing demand on Indigenous artists to always speak and represent and explain, and you know, Bennett's non-performance was a strategic withdrawal from speaking, and you know, how do you respond to this as a strategy? You know, what are the benefits of this kind of refusal? And yeah, that can be for anyone.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I'm sure we're all familiar with the kind of desire that we are always the resident expert, not just for ourselves, but for blackfellas, and even on subjects, not only subjects that we don't know about, and you know, or not interested in. You know, God forbid we should not be interested in something that people are jumping on the bandwagon on, and we should be able to comment on it. But also, there are some stories that aren't ours to tell. Yeah, you know, and it's as simple as that. Certainly for myself, I made the Tall Man video in I think it was 2010, 2011, somewhere around there, and it was because I wanted to say something about Lex Watton's role in Palm Island in 2004, and I wanted people to know what he looked like, and I wanted people to say his name. And it was because when he was released on parole, he was under conditions that were so strict that he was effectively a political prisoner. And it was very clear that the government didn't want him to benefit from his image or his voice or his story or anything. And I'm not the only artist who did this. Richard and Gordy also made work about Palm Island around that time. And and it was true. He was muzzled, and it was quite obscene. And but in 2016, his orders were up, and so now we're at the point where he can tell his story, and he's quite articulate and well spoken, and so his story is not for me to tell. You know, that's only just one small example. And it's quite gratifying that he's able to speak for himself. It's a simple thing, but he wasn't able to do that for years. And it's true of other stories too in our communities. And so that's one aspect of it. But the idea that you know, there are we have ideas of ourselves and where we position ourselves that don't need to be overly explained, and of course we're all tired of having to stand in galleries and in forums and repeat ourselves, you know, and some of those points need repeating because of the level of denial inherent in Australian history and culture and society. But some of those don't need to be, but we are expected to. And so, you know, any wonder that you know, things become irrelevant because they sure are.
Yes.
Yeah.
And maybe Julie, I mean, your work is very much about, you know, sitting in silences and also thinking about the processes of silencing. Yeah, if you wanted to respond.
Thinking about, like, yeah, we need to pick our battles, and yeah, because we have finite energy and time, and yeah, we can get pulled into give endless artist talks or talk off topic or get sidetracked. So yeah, it's really interesting to take time to, that's what's great with things like a pre-COVID artist residencies, etc. You kind of face yourself and go, wait a minute, what am I doing now? Because you do get pulled into it. I was writing something about this idea of that we can get singled out and go through this stage of performative demand, and then we can get stuck if we're kind of intelligently entertaining, and we have to extricate ourselves. And then how best to do that purposefully and productively through our art, which Bennett achieved, you know, but it was a radical decision, because there's sometimes, I would find a kind of permanent repudiation of being interviewed or being able to present difficult to uphold. So yeah, I'm been giving talks here to historical societies in rural locations. So that's kind of an interesting engagement with those that have often held the land deeds for 6+ generations. So yeah, in a way, they come to produce or produce the work. The work comes from some of these engagements where I must talk to listen kind of situation. So, and it's interesting as an artist that, you can be invited to give something because they think a benign artist talk and not really understand there's then a kind of transaction in a way that I can find future useful, such as ways to get through colonial gates that otherwise I'm locked out of. Or so yeah, I suppose I'm being a little there's the word for this, but yeah, it's a little clear cut that I might sometimes do A to get to B, but it's also not always pleasant, or I'm concerned about how to future forecast what any engagement might lead to in relations between those that I don't necessarily know or want a relationship with, or what do they want, or so yeah, very much in a tangle, I'd say. I'm in the midst of a permanently perpetual colonial island down here. Sorry, that was a long answer. I'm a bit off topic again.
Yeah, no, it's very much about, this expectation to participate in identity politics is, coercive and punitive and exhausting. And, Warraba, I was wondering if you shared similarities, you're a different generation from the other artists. If you are kind of coming up against the same kind of problems, the same issues.
Yeah, I think that both responses still reign true, and that definitely one of the things that stands out is I guess again, there's so many different perspectives and contexts, but having the right or the authority to speak on something is one, if that's particularly your story or your connection or whatever it might be within a cultural sense. Knowing your limitations of your experience, but also, if that person has those things, then it's kind of their prerogative whether they want to speak or not speak about it. And, really appreciate Gordon's stance in at one point deciding, no, I'm not going to talk about my work openly. And that's just, so powerful in itself, because he just set the terms, and no one has any other say in it. So yeah, I think it is important to speak to your work. I remember again, Vernon said to me that when if you don't speak to your work, someone else is going to do it for you. And so, you know, opportunity to explain your work and give it the correct context. But, you know, considering art as well, everyone's going to bring their own context to it as well. So I think that it is important, but that shouldn't be synonymous with purely educating people because they're not willing to do the work themselves. And I think that it's a shared responsibility for everyone involved that lives in Australia, no matter your cultural background. For my own experience, I feel like there's you know, we all have different life experiences, and we happen to be artists as well. And so a part of that is there's a social and political issue that is still festering within this country that hasn't been resolved, or various ones. And like I said, we happen to be artists as well. So I can remember a lot of old campaigners saying to me when I was younger that we all have different roles in the struggle, and not everyone is there marching and protesting. Some people are advocating in institutions. Some people are doing fundraising to get, you know, something happening within the community. So I feel like that's also applies to our practices and within discourse of who's speaking to it. Some people are comfortable doing it and have that capability of doing it, but others don't. Other people are doing the research that are then giving it to the people that are talking. So I think it's more of an ecology of people that are building it up, rather than, you know, one person kind of does it. Yeah.
That's great.
Thank you for all of those responses. And maybe there's just time for one question. But, you know, I get a sense that Bennett, you know, often grappled with the utility of art. You know, there are enormous expectations of Indigenous artists to colonize institutions, rewrite social and art histories, you know, reconcile the nation even. So I was just wondering, you know, what keeps you all committed to, you know, making art?
Yeah, I just want to keep questioning. I want others to question. So yeah, so it's sort of a process of demonstrating that, I suppose, showing often in the works I make that there is a big process in particular film works, like the engagement, the addition of whatever else is coming in to create the work beyond, say, footage of country. It's more going on there, intersections with other realms, so cross-disciplinary work. So yeah, I think it's show by example, and then expect or hope or provoke the audience to try, you know, hopefully engage at some level beyond peripheral or just minimal. They yeah, just compelled to keep investigating.
Yeah. For me, art has always been, it's art is for asking questions. So that and we're compelled anyway, but at its core, art is for asking questions. It's not for providing answers. It's for asking questions. That's the role and that of the artist. That's the purpose of art. And you know, I mean, there's an idea that we need to rewrite, you know, engage and be part of the process of decolonizing institutions and rewriting some of the histories and kind of reordering the way we go about things. But then what do we put in its place? And in fact, we've seen lots of attempts at doing this, only to replace it with something that may be a different shape to it, but still serving the same function. And so there's that too, and you know, that's always what happens when you seek to provide answers instead of asking questions, because you know, we've got to come up with a surer kind of solution than just getting together and put it in, and like, you know, thinking that we can provide for everyone in everybody in this country and not have to give anything up. Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, on questions, I'm full of them. So you know, always. So.
Warraba, did you want to add something?
I don't have too much to add besides that, but I think yeah, I think hope that I think art has the power it has real power to change hearts and minds, different situations, educate, grow society, grow ourselves, and so I think, you know, there's while there's still plenty of work to be done, I think that it's I do have a hope that art will be the catalyst for a lot of that.
Thank you. And yeah, I want to thank all of the panelists, Vernon, Julie, Warraba, and also Angela and Tim. You know, it's been such a great experience to, you know, have you share your wisdom and your gutsiness and your hopefulness and your questions with us today. So yeah, it's been a really fantastic and I think necessary discussion, and you know, I look forward to catching up with you all outside of Zoom. I want to thank Angela and Tim for this fantastic publication and dedication to the writings of Gordon Bennett, which has taken many years to happen. I want to thank the people near and far who've helped contribute and support this event tonight, and particularly Anne Bennett and family and the Griffith University Art Museum. I'd like to thank the Power staff for realising this brilliant publication and organising tonight's event. And thank you all for joining us and watching tonight's event. And I hope all of you will be inspired to rush out and get your hands on this publication and absorb its rich intellectual and political power. So thank you very much.